Welcome to the program, God and Country Biblical Exposition, a program that looks at current political, economic, social, prophetic events in the light of biblical exposition. I'm your Bible teacher, Pastor B.E.Winship. Despite what I said last week, I did watch the State of the Union address, and yes, it was filled with political showmanship, platitudes, politically motivated applause, but it was a good speech. As the Democrats stayed glued to their seats, President Obama drew the line in the sand between the two Americas, the philosophy of the political left and the philosophy of the political right. Maybe in an upcoming program I should explain the details of the two Americas. But on today's program, I would like to tackle the issue of immigration reform, which is the president's agenda for this year. This is a hot topic. I noticed that a number of Christian political pundits actually have stated that they do not take a position on the issue. And I can appreciate that. I mean, if our nation decides to bring in more immigrants, what is that to us? It simply means more people for us to evangelize. And the population or the makeup of America is really of no concern to us. We are citizens of the kingdom of Christ. We're on temporary assignment here in America, and this institution called the United States of America is merely a temporary tool ordained by God just to help hold down evil. Our main concerns are the moral issues, the killing of the baby in the womb, the normalization of immorality, so why should we care if there are open borders and sanctuary cities? Well, since the Old Testament does have something to say to Israel about foreigners and immigrants, and since the New Testament instructs the state to judge evil, there are some biblical ethical principles that apply to this whole question of immigration and immigration reform. But first, let's review what's happening. Back in June 2012, President Obama issued an executive order preventing ICE, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, from deporting illegal immigrants who were brought here as young children. This was called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. These children were not given citizenship, but the government would take no action to deport them. So under this program, illegal immigrants who are brought here as children could sign up for legal deferment. Between 700,000 and 800,000 illegal immigrants signed up, and they were called the Dreamers, meaning that they were dreaming of becoming citizens in the United States. This was actually based on a bill back in 2001 called the Dreamer Act. Now, the problem with the president's executive action is that it was unconstitutional for the president to pass laws or to change laws enacted by Congress. DACA was clearly unconstitutional, and this should have been a piece of legislation passed by the Congress, which at the time would likely have passed. Now, 2 years later, in 2014, President Obama ordered an expansion of DACA to include other illegal immigrants, and a number of states sued. The courts agreed, and President Obama's executive orders were considered or declared unconstitutional. So back in September, President Trump rescinded President Obama's DACA order, and he gave Congress 6 months to come up with a piece of legislation to handle the Dreamers' immigration status. The political left, in their continual opposition of President Trump, painted the rescinding of DACA as a horrible thing. But actually, it was the best possible thing for the DACA recipients, because this forces Congress to stop passing the buck and to stand up and pass some legislation. Because without congressional legislation, there is no path for citizenship for the DACA recipients. So Congress has to come up with some DACA legislation before March the 5th, when the extension ends. Even if Congress doesn't come up with a bill, that does not mean the deportation of DACA recipients. In all likelihood, President Trump will order another extension, but if Congress doesn't come up with a bill, that would be bad for the dreamers. They stay in limbo. Now, what President Trump and the Republicans want is a piece of legislation that solves the DACA issue and provides funding for border security, about $25 billion, the wall. So if Republicans have the majority in the House and Senate, why not just pass a bill to build the wall and take care of the DACA? Well, spending bills can be filibustered by the opposing party. It takes 51 votes to pass a bill, but it takes 60 votes to bring that bill to the floor for a vote. And the Republicans don't have 60 votes. So they need to strike a bargain with the Democrats that they would make DACA permanent in exchange for more border security. Now, a couple of weeks ago, the government ran out of legal authority to spend money. And the last agreed upon budget only authorized borrowing limits up to a certain amount. And so a temporary increase in spending needed to be passed until the next full budget resolution is voted upon. This is called the continual budget resolution. And the Democrats said, we will not fund the government unless the Republicans legalize DACA recipients. The Republicans said, no, that is a deal we can work out before March. The Democrats refused, and the government was shut down for 3 days. Then the Democrats relented, realizing that this was looking bad for their party politically. And so the Republicans and the Democrats then passed a piece of legislation to keep the government open for 3 more weeks while Congress works on immigration reform legislation. And so far, here is what the Trump administration and the Republicans are proposing. This is what the president laid out in his State of the Union address. Number 1, DACA recipients would get a path to citizenship over a 10 to 12 year period of time. Not just the original 700,000 illegal immigrants who signed up, but this would open up the list for those who did not get a chance to sign up, which would total about 1.8 million illegals, DACA recipients. Number 2, the Republicans proposed that $25 billion would be earmarked to build the wall. Number 3, there would be an end to chain migration, which ends the policy that if you have become a legal citizen of the United States, your extended family can also come to America. In ending chain migration, only your immediate family would be allowed to have U.S. citizenship. Your spouse, your parents, and your children. Number 4, the ending of the diversity visa lottery program, which awards entrance into the United States to countries that are considered underrepresented in U.S. immigration. In other words, if there are not many Indonesians or Tibetans coming to America, those groups get fast-tracked to citizenship. This is an immigration policy, which means people groups get preference based upon their race or ethnicity, which is ambiguous and really the essence of racism. This policy is affirmative action for the entire makeup of the United States. Just like colleges implement affirmative action so that their student bodies have the same racial percentage as the population at large. The diversity lottery program is in essence saying that the United States has a moral imperative to have the same racial percentages as the rest of the world. So in essence, if 1/7 of the world is African, then the United States needs to have 1/7 of its population African, or about 15%. Or since 1/7 of the world is Chinese, we need to have 15% Chinese. And since 1/7 is Indian, we need another 7th Indian. If the Arabs make up 500 million, we need about 7% Arabs. The Jews, by the way, make up only 0.2% of the world population, yet they make up 1.7% of the U.S. population. So, do we have too many Jews in the United States? The people in the United States of European descent make up 73% of the U.S. population, but they only make up 15% of the world population. So, do we have too many Europeans in the United States? You see, the diversity visa lottery program is sheer social engineering and racism. By any measure of justice, it really needs to end. To quote Martin Luther King, people should not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, by the way, Nancy Pelosi said about the president's proposal that it was a campaign to make America white again. So she tried to make the president's proposal to do away with racism into something that was promoting racism. Now, this proposal by President Trump is more generous than anything that was proposed under President Obama. This is allowing a path to citizenship for at least 1.8 million illegal immigrants. But as it stands right now, the left does not want this deal for a number of reasons, which I will get into, but mostly because the left wants even more. They want citizenship for all illegal immigrants, and they want open borders. But the problem is, if they don't go along with this deal, that makes them look like obstructionists, because this deal gives the dreamers what they want. And if the Democrats refuse to go along with it for partisan reasons, the Democrats look quite petty. Now, the far right is not happy with this plan because it does eventually give citizenship to some illegal immigrants. And they judge this to be a bad precedent. All you have to do is come over to America before you turn 18 and you can get American citizenship. However, most Republicans will go along with this plan because these DACA recipients have to have a clean record, they have to meet other criteria, and this is not immediate. This is a path to citizenship over 10 to 12 years. It's really no different than issuing a green card. Because once a foreign worker gets a green card, within 5 years, that worker can actually apply for citizenship. And the fact is that these dreamers are going to be staying in this country anyway. Practically, there is no way the government is going to deport all of these people. You have to consider the facts and the practicality of any law. You can pass laws based upon pure ideology, but it only makes matters worse if the law is undoable, as in the case of prohibition. Theoretically sound, but practically unworkable. So the anti-illegal immigration hawks need to think practically. I like to use the old analogy of the farmer and the cows. The farmer can create all sorts of boundaries to keep the cows in the barnyard, but once the fence is broken and the cows are all over the county, methods and plans need to change. Since the United States did not adequately enforce immigration for the last 25 years, we have to work with what has already happened. We have to make some concessions, and this is the price we pay for not enforcing the law. So, this proposal from the administration appears to be a reasonable solution, a step in the right direction to solve the problem of so many illegals in our country. This is all great theater. This is all set up by the providence of God. And what interests me is the biblical lessons that we can learn from this event about God, about man, about sin, about salvation, about growth in the Lord. So I have 5 lessons. I'm sure there are more, but I want to start by just sharing 5 that immediately come to my mind. Now, the first is the principle that the children of illegal immigrants should be treated differently than their parents. I recently had a discussion with a friend of mine and said to him, well, you know, the Democrats, in pushing to give citizenship to all illegals, have actually come upon a legitimate moral point, which gives them traction in this whole debate. What do I mean? Deuteronomy 24:16. Fathers shall not be put to death for their sons, nor shall sons be put to death for their fathers. Everyone shall be put to death for his own sins. So there's this biblical principle that children should not pay the price for the sins of their parents. And this has worked its way into Western judicial systems. When parents commit crimes, children are not sent to jail. And often penalties for criminals are mitigated if that criminal has children to care for. Now, in some countries like North Korea, if you commit a crime, your whole family goes to jail. But that's not the way it is in Christian cultures. A few other texts. 2 Chronicles 25. Amaziah was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. He did right in the sight of the Lord, yet not with a whole heart. Now it came about as soon as his kingdom was firmly in his grasp, that he killed his servants who had slain his father the king. However, he did not put their children to death, but did as is written in the law in the book of Moses, which the Lord commanded, saying, Fathers shall not be put to death for sons, nor sons be put to death for fathers, but each shall be put to death for his own sin. And so Amaziah went against the culture of his day, and he did what was biblically correct. He didn't punish the children for the sins of the father. This issue also came up in the days of the prophet Ezekiel. The people thought that it was unfair that sons would not pay the price for the sins of their fathers. And God said to them through Ezekiel in Ezekiel 18:20, the person who sins will die. The son will not bear the punishment for the father's iniquity, nor will the father bear the punishment for the son's iniquity. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself. So, also consider the situation of the Jews wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They were not able to enter into the promised land because of their disobedience. They all died in the wilderness, but their children were allowed to enter the promised land. Deuteronomy 139, moreover, your little ones, who you said would become prey, and your sons, who this day have no knowledge of good or evil, shall enter there, the promised land. I will give it to them, and they shall possess it. And if you remember, the cutoff point was 20 years of age. Numbers 32:11. None of the men who came up from Egypt, from 20 years old and upward, shall see the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, for they did not follow me fully. So the children were exempt from the punishment of the law broken by the parents. Think also about the compassion that God had toward the Ninevites. The Syrians, the parents, were guilty of terrible violence. But what does God say to Jonah? Jonah chapter 4:11, should I not have compassion on the Ninevites? Nineveh, the great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know the difference between their right and left hand, as well as many animals. So the judgment was mitigated because of the children. The children were not to be punished with the parents. So what does this have to do with DACA? Well, it's reasonable to give extra consideration to those who are taken to America and raised in America due to no crime of their own. I mean, we are already naturalizing 700,000 immigrants every year. Sometimes 800,000. I think in 2008 it was 1 million. So why not put these DACA recipients also in the queue, as long as they've been good citizens so far? People intrinsically know that there should be consideration for the children, and this is an argument that you cannot win. Like they say in showbiz, never get up and do an act after children or animals. They steal the show. Now, my friend insisted that they're still breaking the law. Well, a case could be made that there's nothing wrong with sending them back to their country of origin. They should be proud to return to their own people, but the reality is their home is not their home country. We tend to be products of where we were raised. Now, those on the left supporting illegal immigrants and open borders know that sympathy for the children advances their cause with the public. And that brings me to my second lesson. Often a moral virtue is used to leverage an immoral policy. So apart from the question of immigration or illegal immigration itself, there are some timeless lessons to be learned in this whole issue about how politicians will use a righteous principle as a wedge to bring in lawlessness. For example, abortion is murder, but it's sold by attaching itself to some other virtue. Women's rights, personal freedom, or using abortion to save the life of the mother as a wedge to legalize all abortions. Like Satan in the garden. He didn't simply come to Eve and say, you need to sin and partake of the forbidden fruit. But instead, he sold the sin by linking it to some other virtue. Your eyes will be opened. You can have knowledge. And isn't education a good thing? So we need to understand how Satan tempts and how this game is played. Jesus said in Matthew 10:16, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be shrewd as serpents and as harmless as doves. Know how the serpent propagates evil in your own personal temptations and in public discourse. Understand how unprincipled civic leaders will use a virtue to pass a vice. Now, once you recognize that this is being done, the way to defeat this tactic is to separate the issues. Don't let evil lump everything together. Satan comes and claims that the only way to get the virtue of knowledge is by eating of the forbidden fruit. Says who? Maybe God has a better way for our eyes to be opened. Why can't knowledge come by being obedient to the law of God? Why does knowledge have to come by breaking the law of God? You don't have to do evil to accomplish good. There can be exceptions for the life of the mother without legalizing all abortion. And we don't have to have complete open borders and naturalize all illegals just because of the dreamers. So if the political right is smart, they will take the moral argument away from the political left by giving a pathway of citizenship to the dreamers. Then those on the political left no longer have a strong moral argument for their broader agenda. So when it comes to the tactic that groups use to take a moral argument to justify a broader immoral policy, remember to always separate the issues. The one thing does not require the whole. This is called the law of the excluded middle, which is a classic fallacy in logic. This is where a proponent of a position paints the only alternatives as being polar opposites and ignores the fact that there is a middle position that's just as valid, a position that's not being considered. And that's why it's called the law of the excluded middle. The person makes you think that there is only an either-or solution on the opposite ends of the spectrum. Either we legalize all abortion or all women will die. Or, as in John 11:48, the only solution is that we kill Jesus or the Romans will come and take over our nation. The typical fallacy of the law of the excluded middle. So the point is, don't let evil fool you with this fallacy. Now, in the case of immigration reform, let's again define what is the vice and what is the virtue. The virtue is consideration for the children, and the vice is to break down national boundaries and to have open borders. It's that wrong-headed policy that no person should be considered illegal. That everyone should be able to live anywhere they please. That all borders should be broken down. If the Japanese economy starts to do 10 times better than the U.S. economy, I should have the right to walk over the Japanese border to live in Japan. And if the Japanese government tries to deport me, I should have the right to protest the Japanese government. Now, that sounds ridiculous in context, but that is what many pro-immigrant groups are saying. This is their ethical position. And it looks like the spirit of lawlessness. It's the nobody can tell me what to do mentality. Nobody can tell me what gender I ought to be. Nobody can tell me what I can do with the baby in my womb. Nobody can tell me what I can smoke, what drugs I can use. And this is the spirit of lawlessness, the spirit of the age. And it is found in so many areas of our culture, and it's also driving views on immigration. Now, someone might say immigration laws are unjust. Doesn't the Bible say we should welcome the stranger? Leviticus 19:34, the stranger who resides with you shall be to you as a native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Yes, that law, that principle is true. But remember, the people on the political right are not protesting immigration or immigrants. What they are protesting is illegal immigration. We are naturalizing about 700,000 immigrants every single year. That is huge. No other country in the world is that generous. And the reason for having a process is to protect our country from crimes, from drugs. You may have heard of all the horrible stories of what's taking place on the border. People are pouring over and crime is taking place. And really, to be fair, people should wait in line. Nobody likes a bully that cuts in line. But when it comes to illegal immigration, that kind of bullying sometimes gets overlooked. The Bible does not support illegal immigration. Deuteronomy 32:8, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of men, he set boundaries for the people. But my point here is that often a moral virtue is used to leverage an immoral, unbiblical policy. But moving on here. That's just the tactic. That's how an immoral policy is advanced over the goal line. That's Isaiah 5:18. Iniquity is dragged along with the cords of falsehood. But let's consider the original motive for this unprincipled policy. Why does the left want illegal immigrants, illegal immigration? And that brings me to lesson number 3. Illegal immigration is pushed out of a belief in globalism and a one-world government. Now, earlier I mentioned that support for illegal immigration seems to be coming out of an almost unconscious spirit of lawlessness in the hearts and the minds of many Americans. But the lawlessness itself is the tearing down of nations and borders. I wasn't even planning to mention this point until I heard Joe Kennedy in his rebuttal to the President's State of the Union address. Kennedy said, "Build a wall and my generation will tear it down." This is one of the most telling and revealing remarks. It's not that the left just wants citizenship for illegal immigrants. They don't want any borders. Ideologically, they despise national sovereignty, and they see no reason for national sovereignty. I've spoken about this before in regard to immigration, but remember Genesis chapter 11? The Tower of Babel, the ancient people wanted to create a one-world government, and God divided up the languages, and he thwarted the project. Genesis chapter 11. The Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have the same language." And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. The point is that the people, in their sin, should not have been allowed to consolidate power. So God ordained and appointed nations. Acts chapter 17 verse 26, he appointed the boundaries of their habitation. So one of the values of Christianity has always been nationalism and national sovereignty. Now, there is an idolatrous form of patriotism, but Christianity promotes a healthy patriotism. The secular humanist, in abandoning Christian values, naturally moves toward anti-patriotism, toward globalism, and toward a one-world government. And so in the book of the Revelation, with the rise of the Antichrist, we see a one-world government. The Tower of Babel restored, man's rebellion to God. So how is that going to come about in the future? In a single moment, will the people of the world switch from nationalistic ideals to globalistic ideals? No, over a period of years, over a generation, people in abandoning Christian values will gradually begin to hate nationalism, begin to hate borders, and have an affinity toward a borderless globalism. Build the wall, and our generation will tear it down. Now, by the way, last week, Dennis Prager put out an article entitled 3 Reasons Why the Left Wants Ever More Immigrants. And he writes the following: the left's support for virtually unlimited immigration is that one of the most enduring tenets of the left, from Karl Marx to the present-day Democratic Party and left-wing parties in Western Europe, is that the nation-state is an anachronism. For the left, reverence for the national anthem and the flag is a pathetic patriotism, celebrated by the simple-minded and the deplorable. Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto ends with an appeal to class solidarity, not national solidarity. Proletariat of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. So Prager is reminding us that atheistic communism always moves toward a one-world government, centralized power, the Tower of Babel rebuilt. So beware of the no-border proponents. So this immigration issue is just another reminder of what the Bible teaches about the prophetic day of secular globalism. And this brings me to a 4th biblical spiritual truth that is illustrated in the immigration debate. To review, number 1, what the Bible teaches about special consideration for children. Number 2, how vice is often sold by attaching it to some virtue. Number 3, illegal immigration is pushed out of a belief in globalism and in a one-world government. And now, number 4, policy is often pushed for reasons of personal power. Money, votes, fame. Let me give you a few verses. Micah chapter 3, verse 11. Her leaders pronounce judgment for a bribe. Her priests instruct for a price. And her prophets divine for money. Micah 7:3. Concerning evil, both hands do it well. The prince asks, and also the judge for a bribe. And a great man speaks the desire of his soul, so they weave it together. Isaiah 1:23. Your rulers are rebels and companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and chases after rewards. So rather than a policy being pushed on the basis of moral principle, it is often pushed on the basis of personal gain. And it's been well documented in the media that the left's push for illegal immigration is for the purpose of getting millions of new Democratic voters, because they're hoping and assuming that poor immigrants will favor the socialistic agenda of the Democratic Party. There was a recent leaked Democratic Party memo that stated, illegal immigration is key to our party's future electoral success. Now, both parties do this all the time. They take positions and they push for policies based upon utilitarianism. What will help them? And because in their view of morality that doesn't consider God, what is right is really whatever is beneficial. Whereas the biblical view of morality is that the thing which is morally right is often personally non-beneficial, but you do it anyway because it's the right thing to do. Psalm 15, he who walks in integrity and works righteousness and speaks truth in his heart, he swears to his own hurt and does not change. In other words, he does the right thing even when it hurts him personally. But the unprincipled politician will promote a cause, even a good cause, to get votes. In Ron Kessler's book, Inside the White House, The Hidden Lives of the Modern Presidents and the Secrets of the World's Most Powerful Institution, he records an account of LBJ, President Johnson, discussing the 1964 Civil Rights Act with two governors. And President Johnson said about the Democrats' support of the Civil Rights Act, "I'll have them Negroes voting Democrat for the next 200 years. Kessler writes, "It was not because LBJ wanted equality for everyone. It was strictly a political ploy for the Democratic Party. He was a phony from the word go." Now, Democrats claim there were not enough witnesses to prove that LBJ ever said those words. But it is well proven that he was a racist. And it's documented that he said these Negroes are getting pretty uppity these days. And that's a problem for us since they've got something they never had before: the political pull to back up their uppityness. Now we've got to do something about this. We've got to give them a little something. Just enough to quiet them down, not enough to make a difference. For if we don't move at all, then their allies will line up against us. So LBJ didn't care about the blacks. He didn't care about the rightness or the wrongness of the Civil Rights Act. All he cared about was his political party and votes. And that's just a prime example of how policy is pushed for political power. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, they didn't care about Jesus. They cared about their political power. Pilate didn't care about Jesus. All he cared about was keeping the peace so that he could maintain his governorship and not get into any trouble with Rome. So the fight on the part of some to defend and legalize illegal immigrants is not necessarily a moral crusade that's as white as the pure driven snow. Even if you are for the citizenship of illegals, you have to acknowledge that politicians have ulterior, self-serving motives. But, some people might say, well, so what if the motives are bad? You're still getting something good done. For example, when King Henry VIII broke England's ties to the papacy and he freed England from Romanism, he did a good thing even though he was doing it for self-serving motives. So who cares? God can use people's self-serving motives. But remember this, King Henry also started his own church, the Anglican Church. And he made himself the head of that church. And almost always you will find that when there are evil motives, the thing itself is also mixed with evil. Does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. James chapter 3. Or as Jesus said, a bad tree cannot bring forth good fruit. So it's never right to play on people's evil motives, even to get a seemingly good thing accomplished. It usually ends in bad things. Lesson number 5. Lesson number 4 was a policy is often pushed for reasons of personal power. Lesson number 5, a policy is often thwarted for reasons of personal power. Even the media itself is saying that the Democrats do not want to pass any Republican immigration reform legislation before the 2018 midterm elections, because they want to run on immigration reform. And if Donald Trump and the Republicans create a path of citizenship for the Dreamers, there goes their issue. Remember, politicians thrive on finding grievances, and they thrive on problems, and then they claim that they are the solution to those problems. But if the problems are solved, they have nothing to run on. Are politicians really that self-serving? Well, what do you think? This is why, as America is becoming more ungodly, parties are not working together on solutions. This is why Washington is always in gridlock these days. They don't want to work with the other party lest the other party gets the credit. So they will deliberately sabotage a good policy until they're the ones in power and they can pass the same policy. Do we ever see this in the Bible, where one side thwarts the success of the other side? Well, take for example, King Saul and David. 1 Samuel 18. The women sang as they played, and they said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000, but to me they have ascribed only thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. You see, Saul should have been rejoicing that Israel was defeating her foreign enemies. But he was angry because David was the one helping the nation. He was more concerned with his own power and his image than in what was good for the people. Remember John chapter 9? The man who was born blind was healed by Jesus. The Pharisees should have been rejoicing that the people were being healed, but they were enraged because Jesus was the one getting the credit. So the Pharisees, rather than coming out and saying, well, we don't like that Jesus is getting the credit, they make up an excuse that this was an evil thing because the healing was done on the Sabbath. And I'm sure there were plenty of Jews in Jesus' day that actually believed the excuse of the Pharisees, thinking that the Pharisees were really concerned about sabbatical laws. And in the same way, there are naive people today who believe the excuses that political parties come up with as to why they are thwarting good legislation. So don't be naive. When good policy is thwarted, it's often because opponents want to take the credit and get power for themselves. As Ronald Reagan once said, there is no limit to the amount of good you can do if you don't mind who gets the credit. So those are just 5 lessons drawn from the current immigration reform debate. There are many more biblical principles that could be brought out. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 9. Behold, I have found out this, that God made men upright, but they have sought out many devices. The Hebrew word here for devices means evil plotting and plan. It's used in Zechariah chapter 7 verse 10. Do not devise evil in your hearts against one another. It's used in Genesis 50:20. As for you, you meant or devised evil against me. So people in their sinful nature play all sorts of games to justify and advance their disobedience and rebellion to God. And it's our job to see it, to expose it in others, and to expose it in ourselves when we see it in ourselves, because we too can be deceived. By the way, to be pure and to be free from sin, and to be free from unprincipled behavior, first, find forgiveness and salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. And second, set all of your biases and your personal prejudices aside and follow biblical teaching on every single issue. Thanks for listening today. As I mentioned last week, this week was going to be about Zechariah chapter 11 and the foolish shepherds. I moved that to next week because this immigration issue is so important and it's front and center. So next week I'm going to be likely talking about Zechariah chapter 11. Don't forget to click on the YouTube button and subscribe to this YouTube channel. This helps increase the influence of Christian programming. This puts new God and Country videos in your suggestion list. All the contact information is on my closing slide. Feel free to email me with questions, comments, insights. May God richly bless you as you live in obedience to Him.